Now it's a great pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Angel Veza. Angel's a senior manager for capital innovation and engagement at ReFed, which is an organization, a really innovative one that has a laser-like focus on food waste. She's been an incredibly important partner to the Mitchell Center's food waste team, which is led by Suzanne Lee. If you want to know more about that team's work, just put Food Rescue Maine in your browser to learn about the solutions that they're being developed and the ones they are implementing right here in our own state. Of course, we're no stranger in Maine to connections between food waste and many other sustainability issues, methane emissions from landfills, the general and crucial problem of food insecurity, the excess agricultural inputs like fertilizer and water to farms that produces food that never gets eaten, and even the tipping fees, what they charge taxpayers to send your waste to the landfills, is a pretty big burden for taxpayers and municipalities. So Angel's an expert in all of that. She has co-authored a number of innovative reports about ReFed's work. Before she worked at ReFed, she was working on food waste issues at the world's largest conservation organization, World Wildlife Fund. She's also received awards for her leadership in the culinary industry. Angel is such a great speaker that she gave one of the keynote addresses at the first 2 annual Maine Food Waste Solutions Summit meetings. So I know you're in for a treat. And on that topic, the next Maine Food Waste Summit is coming up 3 weeks from this Friday on April 14th. So I hope you can join us. So please join me in welcoming Angel to the Mitchell Center.
Thank you so much, David, for that really warm welcome. I feel like you should be my hype man for all of my webinars and speaking events. So thank you so much. Let me go ahead and share my screen for the presentation today. And again, just want to give a huge thanks to everyone who's tuning in today and joining us. It's a real honor to be able to participate in the Mitchell Center Sustainability Series. As David mentioned, my name is Angel Veza, and I'm the Senior Manager on ReFed's Capital Innovation and Engagement team. And for those of you who aren't familiar with ReFed, just want to take a moment to give you a bit of background on the work that we do. So ReFed is a national nonprofit working to advance solutions to prevent food waste in the United States, with the goal of cutting it by 50% by 2030. Now, at the foundation of our work is our insights engine, which fuels our online solutions hub and database for food loss and waste, designed to help people take meaningful action. Now, using that knowledge, we work directly with funders to help mobilize the $14 billion of funding needed to drive food waste reduction in the US. And we also drive collaboration and connections among stakeholders from across the entire food system, ranging from government agencies to food waste solution providers to food businesses, through our platforms like the ReFed Food Waste Action Network. So enough about ReFed. I am told by the Mitchell Center that many of you joining in today have a general understanding of the food waste reduction opportunity. So I thought we'd kick things off with a little trivia. So first question for the group: how much of all food produced in the world for human consumption is wasted? Is it A, 1/8, B, 1/4, C, 1/3, or D, 1/2? And if your answer is C, 1/3, you'd be right. In fact, that food that is wasted is roughly the value of $1 trillion, and it contributes to 8% of the global greenhouse gas emissions. Now, you may have heard this already, but just to help paint the picture, globally, if food waste could be represented as its own country, it would be the 3rd largest greenhouse gas emitter, right behind China and the United States. And still, when I say it, it blows my mind. But just to bring it home for a second, let's go on to the next question. How many tons of food do you think was wasted in Maine in 2019? Was it A, 96,000 tons, B, 108,000 tons, C, 213,000 tons, or D, 250,000 tons? Now, if your answer is C, 213,000 tons, you would be right. And the value of that waste is about $1.27 billion. Because when we waste food, we're essentially wasting money. Now let's talk about the different types of food that is wasted. So in the US, what do you think is the most common type of food wasted? Is it A, produce, B, dairy and eggs, C, meat and seafood, or D, prepared foods? And if you picked A, produce, you would absolutely be right. As you can see here on our Insights Engine Food Waste Monitor, produce and prepared foods are the most commonly wasted foods. Why? Well, with produce, they're highly perishable and they already have a shorter shelf life. But once you start cutting them, prepping them, working with them, that starts to decrease their shelf life even more. All right, so last question. At what point along the supply chain does the most food waste occur? Is it A, farms, B, manufacturing, C, grocery retailers, or D, residential? And the answer is, ding, 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 D, residential. And that's you and me, that's consumers. We are the main generators of food waste. Now, of course, surplus food, and when I say surplus food, I'm talking about food that goes unsold or uneaten, and that does include food that is sent to landfills. That's generated across the entire supply chain. But it mostly occurs in consumer-facing businesses like grocery retailers, restaurants, and food service settings, and then in homes. Now, we don't see it as much at the manufacturing level because they have very efficient operations and they know, again, when they waste food, they're essentially wasting money. So in fact, all of the food that went unsold or uneaten in the US in 2019 was valued at $408 billion. That's about 2% of the US GDP. So as you can see, there are negative economic consequences when we waste food. And everyone in this room knows that wasting food also contributes to climate change. Because food that is produced but never eaten, it still requires enormous resources to grow, harvest, transport, cool, cook, or otherwise prepare, even when it's disposed of. So uneaten food is responsible for 4% of greenhouse gas emissions in the US alone, and it consumes cropland and freshwater, and it's one of the top materials entering landfills today. Now that's why there's a national and international goal that's been set to cut food waste in half by 2030. And it's 2023, so the clock is ticking. So we have to take action now. And today we're going to talk about a few different things. First, what are some of those drivers of wasted food in consumer-facing businesses and homes? And we're zooming in on those particular points on the supply chain because, as I mentioned, that's where most of the food waste is generated. We'll also discuss what some of the emerging innovations are that can tackle those challenges and where there's still gaps for innovation. And then lastly, we want to understand what's needed to accelerate those innovations so that we can achieve our collective goal. So I know I said innovation a few different times, and you may be wondering, what exactly do I mean by that? And for the purposes of this presentation, when I say innovation, I'm talking about a food waste solution that is either at the idea or concept stage, or there's a minimum viable product, or there's a beta prototype. In other cases, the solution has already been tested and it's ready to be replicated or ready for global expansion here in the US. But most importantly, the innovations that we'll be talking about today removes those barriers and challenges, it creates value, and it can lead to new behaviors and habits. So keep those three things in mind because we're going to look for these aspects as we talk about these different solutions. So first, with that in mind, let's talk about grocery retailers. Based on our data, the main cause for wasted food in the grocery retail sector is date labeling concerns. Now let's pause for a moment and talk about what exactly those date labels are. When we have all seen like the best by, sell by, best if used by, freeze by, and all other sorts of versions of this language on products. Oftentimes, most people think that this language and that date indicates you need to consume the product before that date. And if you don't, then likely maybe the product is bad and you should throw it away. Here's the thing though, there is no federal regulation on date labels, and it's not based on food safety. In fact, the only product that has any sort of regulation is infant formula. And even then, it's based on the shelf life of the nutrients in the formula. Now, originally, these dates were actually used as an inventory tool, but now in some ways it actually benefits the industry because, right, if you throw away the product sooner, you buy more product, and it eventually became this unintended status quo. So now there's no real incentive to change this. But what do? Right, we know that there's this confusion around date labels. It's generating wasted food. So how can businesses make better decisions about what to do with their product? Well, most of us have heard about blockchain technology and cold chain technology, and it is making a lot of headway both in the food and pharmaceutical industry. But what's really exciting to see is more predictive analytics that can help make better informed decisions. And a great example of this in the grocery retail sector is the innovator Transparent Pack. Now, what they do is they actually collect, harvest, and packaging information from the source. Then they gather all this environmental data like temperature, humidity, shock, and color. And then this collected information is used to determine the level of food freshness. So they call that the fresh score. And they determine that freshness level from the source all the way to the end retail destination using data science, predictive analytics, and machine learning algorithms. Now, of course, the risk, right, is that the availability and quality of data is going to determine how accurate that fresh score will be. But ultimately, what it does, it takes out all the guesswork, and it removes the barrier by displaying a current and predicted fresh score, and it tracks its history and provides metrics on the suggested optimum range, all while in transit to the grocery store. So it helps create value for grocery retailers in that it helps ensure that they get the product that they want. And if for some reason they don't get the level of freshness that they're looking for, it gives them the power to negotiate based on real-time data. The other benefit too is that if a product is potentially, let's say, at risk during transit, there is the possibility to redirect that shipment to a closer retail destination and getting it on the shelves faster. Now, if we look at it on the other side, once it's in the store, managers will have more visibility into the freshness of a product and can make better decisions about how to manage that inventory. So as an example, they might be able to get that food discounted more quickly and even get it onto platforms like Too Good To Go or Flash Food so that they can still sell that product. But it also creates value for their business in that market research is showing us consumers want more transparency. So by having this fresh score on their products in the stores, it can help increase customer satisfaction and loyalty. But all in all, this solution removes the barrier of not knowing the freshness of a product, right? So that's one criteria for this innovation. And what it does, it provides value in the sense that it is giving real-time data and predictive analytics to accurately assess the freshness of a product. Now it's changing how stores and operators are managing everything because they're equipped to make well-informed decisions on how to manage their product during shipment and in the store. Great. So now we've talked about grocery retailers. Let's shift gears and talk about a different consumer-facing business. Let's look at restaurants and food service companies. So in these types of settings, the main contributors of waste are plate waste. And when I say plate waste, I'm talking about the food that's remaining on your dish when you're eating at a restaurant. And then the other major contributor is overproduction. So this is all the leftover food at a buffet, as an example. Let's first talk about plate waste. So when most people try to think of a solution for plate waste, the common idea is, well, why don't we just offer smaller portion sizes? And that's not a bad idea, but here's a challenge though. Smaller portion sizes can go against a restaurant's value proposition to their guests. So let's take a restaurant chain like Buffalo Wild Wings, let's say. Their value proposition is delicious wings, and a lot of them at a reasonable price. And maybe for a few bucks more, they'll give you a combo. And of course, at Buffalo Wild Wings, you can beer and watch sports, and that's their value proposition. That's how they make money. The moment that they start to offer smaller portion sizes, they risk decreasing customer satisfaction because they're no longer delivering on the value proposition that they promised. And this is true also for independent restaurants, not just chains, because quite frankly, consumers aren't demanding smaller portion sizes. And so there's no incentive for these restaurant owners to do anything differently. You know, I have worked in multiple restaurants in New York City and with food service companies, and I've never had a guest come and complain and say, the kitchen gave me way too much food and I demand my money back. Like, that would never happen. Oftentimes, customers just want to walk away feeling like they got their money's worth. And so there's no incentive, again, for these businesses to change their behaviors or operations. So what could be an innovative solution that both creates value for the guests and changes operations and ultimately reduces food waste? The reality is this is actually where we need some innovative solutions. Refed works with roughly 1,000 solution providers in the space, and we're consistently growing our solution provider directory, talking to different startups. But as far as we know, there isn't one innovative solution provider right now that's directly tackling the issue of plate waste. What we have seen, though, is different businesses trying to take a stab at it in their own ways. So there's actually one restaurant chain that is trying to address this challenge, and that's Wingstop. And if you're not familiar with them, it is a quick service restaurant chain, and as the name implies, they sell things like chicken wings and chicken sandwiches. And what they did was develop what they call their wing calculator. And how it works is that it helps customers better decide how much food they should be ordering based on how hungry they feel. So you can see if you're feeling a little snacky, maybe, and you just want some wings, maybe you should get 10. Or if you are looking for some sides and a drink, like this 6-piece combo is best for you. And that's been a game changer for Wingstop because it provides their guests with tailored options unique to them based on how hungry they feel and the number of people that are being fed. The challenge that they're removing in terms of plate waste is a result of not being able to accurately forecast how much food guests actually want. So the value they provide is giving guests these tailored menu options. And now the change in their operations is, well, hey, now I have better insight into who my customers are and what they want. And now I can improve my ordering, improve my prep, and ultimately reduce food waste across my entire food value chain. And that's what's really interesting about something like this. Now, let's switch gears for a second and talk about buffets in food service setting. And you have probably seen this in hotels or in corporate offices, but the reality is there is a demand for a buffet style format in which when people walk in, they want to see an abundance of food. And so again, if that's what their customers are looking for, there's really no incentive for businesses to change their operations because that's their value proposition. But of course, when you do have that format, one of your biggest concerns is running out of food, right? You're supposed to have this abundance, you can't run out. And that's what leads to the overproduction. Part of what happens though is that it can be really difficult to accurately track food consumption in a setting like this. And so as a result, there is poor demand forecasting. So the culinary teams are just pushing out more and more and more food. Now there's a lot of overproduction. So one company that's a little newer that's trying to tackle this is called MetaFoodX. What their system does is it actually automatically tracks when ingredients or prepared foods are taken from a station based on weight and sensor trackers. So what this does then is now cooks and operators can see this information, how full a station is, and in real time, they can optimize their mid-service operations. So as an example, if a dish is running low, the system's going to alert the culinary team to prepare just enough food and only as much needed in just-in-time batches. So that way, they're decreasing their overproduction base. So similar to Wingstop's calculator, MetaFoodX's system is removing all those barriers around accurate demand forecasting while still generating value for their guests and meeting their promised value proposition, like wanting an abundance of food when you go to a buffet. And what's great though is that the behavior that it's promoting is better ordering and prep based on this new information and accurate demand forecasting, which again prevents overproduction. So we've looked at grocery retail settings, we've looked at restaurants, we've looked at food service settings. So let's switch gears for a second and let's talk about the waste that's being generated at the household level. I have a question for the group just to kind of get us thinking about what happens at home, but curious to hear what leads to food going uneaten in your home. Some things that we hear is that, hey, I forgot that I had it in the fridge. It was all the way in the back and it went bad. Or I don't know when I stored it and I ended up tossing it just to be safe. Or honestly, I can't even tell if this is still good or not. And so again, to play it safe, I tossed it. And these are kind of these are the things that we often hear through customer discovery interviews and surveys and the research that's been done. So if your answer for your home is a mix of the above or a combination of other reasons, you're absolutely not alone. Now, what oftentimes is recommended is that you organize your fridge, right, in such a way that you know what to eat first. And restaurants do this too, right? It's that first in, first out method. And some people are great at this. They're really dedicated. They're diligent about keeping their fridges organized in this way. And that's awesome. But if you're not one of those people, maybe it's too manual of a process and you want something a bit convenient, or maybe you still find yourself guessing even with that system and you're just not quite sure if something's still good or not. That can happen. So what has come out today is these smart storage containers. And the reality is that food storage has basically been the same for decades. But the idea behind these storage containers is that it can help you remember when exactly you stored the food in your fridge. And also it can help you track and understand the environments in which they were stored, like humidity and temperature, so that you can have a better understanding of its freshness. Many of these storage containers are also connected to your phone. So it can send you reminders of what you already have. That way, let's say you're at the grocery store and you're like, no, I can't remember if we still have lettuce and carrots. But with the app, what's nice is that it tracks that for you and you'd be like, okay, actually, I still have it. I don't need to buy it. So it can prevent overbuying products. So as you can see, it does remove the barrier of forgetting what's in your fridge and having to manually organize it. It creates value because it automates that process for you and sends you reminders. And with that information, it can help change consumers' behavior because now you can make better decisions on what to purchase and when to eat your food so that it doesn't get wasted. Now, of course, a lot of what this storage unit is really helping with is leftovers, right? But we also know that at home, there is another type of food product that gets wasted, and that's trim and byproduct when preparing food. So just take a moment and consider, what are some of the most commonly thrown out trim and byproducts in your home? It could be vegetable peelings, maybe it's eggshells, could be coffee grounds, or fruit peels and the rinds and the seeds. I'll just say for me, very commonly, the things that I have are coffee grounds and fruit trim. That's the types of stuff we usually have in terms of byproducts. Now, of course, we can find great, unique culinary ways to upcycle these products at home. Like for me, I've actually made coffee ground biscotti. It is great. If you want the recipe, I'll send it to you. And of course, I've also used vegetable trim to make a vegetable stock. But like many other people, life gets busy and there's time constraints. And we're not always able to upcycle these products in the way that we would prefer to. So what I do, and I'm very lucky, is when I can't do that, I compost. So in my neighborhood, there are compost drop-off sites. We also have residential compost pickup. But again, I am very fortunate to live in a city that offers this. And it's not the case for many areas. In some regions, there's just no composting infrastructure at all. And even if there's a desire for that, it can be really costly to build that infrastructure. And in some cases, there are independent for-profits that are providing that service, but that service isn't free and it can be expensive and not accessible to everybody. In other cases, when there are these options, sometimes there are limits in terms of when the pickups are, when the drop-off times are. Maybe it's only once a week, maybe it's once a month. But what ends up happening with those limited days and times is that sometimes it results in being really inconvenient in that for an individual, they're holding onto their organic waste. Maybe they're trying to store it in their freezer, but it ends up creating odors. It sometimes can attract pests and becomes really problematic. So many of you have probably heard that now there are these kitchen countertop composters that can transform your trim and byproduct into a shelf-stable, consistent, odorless output. And it can be composted or used in your garden. Now, there are a few different companies that offer this now, and every appliance is a little different, but in concept, they're generally the same. So it is a great option in the sense that it can remove the barriers that some regions face in terms of limited access to traditional composting infrastructures. It does give people another opportunity to divert their organic waste from landfill. And of course, it does create value because now people have a new soil amendment that they can use. So they're saving money on fertilizer. And also because there's no need for the compost hauling trucks, it's taking more trucks off the road and avoiding more greenhouse gas emissions. From the studies we've seen from the users that have a countertop composter like this, it helps them actually stay aware of what they're wasting. So in fact, they've actually seen that the more users use this, they actually run cycles less frequently because they're wasting less food. So there is some nice impacts as we think about preventing food waste and having this composter for people to use. So now let's take a step back. We've talked about a bunch of different innovations at different points along the supply chain. So let's talk about why some of these innovations aren't more widely available and what are some of the things that need to happen to really scale them. So first up, the reality is that a lot of the things that I talked about today are early stage and they're viewed as risky, especially by traditional funders. And when you're new to the market, it's often costly to make your product, which then makes it expensive. And as a result, at least in the early days, it's only accessible to affluent populations. So what can we do to alleviate these challenges? Well, first, there needs to be more catalytic funding. And I'll talk more about what exactly that means, but it can unlock impact. And secondly, there needs to be an openness to pilots and partnerships to test these innovations and prove out their model to create demand. More demand, more units, and over time, it will be cheaper to make and therefore more accessible. All right, so let's talk about these two solutions I just identified. I first mentioned catalytic funding. And so to take a step back, ReFed's analysis shows that $14 billion in annual funding is needed to accelerate and scale solutions to food waste in order to reach that collective goal of cutting food waste in half by 2030. Now, of that total amount, $3 billion is needed annually in the form of catalytic funding. And that is capital that's patient, risk tolerant, and flexible to allow it to unlock impact. And I'll give you an example. So we've seen a great case study of catalytic capital in action within prevention solutions in the $100,000 research grant funding that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation provided to Appeal Sciences in 2012. For context, what Appeal Sciences offers is a solution that's an edible coating product that can be used on things like avocados, citrus, and other types of fruit. And what it does, it actually extends the shelf life of the fruit by roughly 2 times the traditional shelf life without it. And it's this tasteless edible coating that's actually made from plant materials. So the grant that the foundation gave to Appeal was in 2012, and it was used to reduce post-harvest food waste in the global South. And that was really successful. So fast forward about 9 years later, and Appeal has grown to be a widely recognized leader in shelf life extension. And in 2021, they saved 33 million pieces of fruit from going to waste at grocery stores. So as you can see, this catalytic funding, it was patient. It took 9 years to see that 33 million pieces of fruit from going to waste. It was risk tolerant because back in 2012, Appeal was still a very early company and there were risks associated with it because there were so many unknowns. But that funding was really tolerant of that risk and it allowed them to prove out their model. And so right now, yes, this is an example of grant funding, but catalytic funding can come in all sorts of forms. It can be impact investments, government funding, you could have non-recoverable grants and recoverable grants, but that's what's so great is that it is flexible. So that's one solution to really help scale these innovations that we're talking about. Let's talk about partnerships and pilots. So sometimes it literally takes a village to test and prove out a model and eventually create demand. So we're going to talk about a really specific case study where this was successful. So to go back to the example of the composters, as we all know, rural, remote, and indigenous and underserved communities oftentimes have limited access to recycling solutions. So a company, Food Cycle Science Corporation, which does offer their food cycler, it's one of the countertop composter appliances, partnered with the Mohawk Council of Akwesasne in Canada, which is an indigenous community with no access to a composting facility. And so together, they partnered and launched a pilot program to trial the food cycler solution in this type of setting. In the pilot, Food Cycle provided 100 units to the households in the community. As a result, it was great because they were able to achieve a new diversion of residential waste. They reduced those greenhouse gas emissions and residents loved it. They actually, 100% of them actually indicated that they want to continue their food cycler. And it was so successful that the council is now looking for funding to expand the program to the rest of the community. So as you can see, now it's creating demand. It's proving out that model. And it's really exciting to see. So we've talked about a lot of different cases in which consumer-facing businesses and households can use different innovations and what is needed to scale them. But look, I'm not here to say that innovation is going to be the end-all be-all and it's going to solve food waste. I'm saying that this is an and situation. I'm saying that we need all of the existing solutions. like maximizing product utilization, like traditional composting and AD solutions. We also need policy. We need more food businesses and institutions to make commitments and take action. And we as individuals need to continue to take preventive measures to reducing food waste. We need all of this. But we also do still have a need for innovation to reach our collective goal of cutting food waste by 50% by 2030. Because again, as we've seen today, innovation can remove barriers and challenges, create value, and change behavior and drive action. And we need that alongside all the work that's already being done. And with that, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate the chance to present these different solutions to you.
Well, Angel, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and all of these great innovations. I'll start by providing some of the questions from the chat, and we'll send things around. I'll do my poor man's Linda Silka impersonation as best I can today, who's our commonly our moderator. Someone talked a little bit about different types of food measurement systems. You brought up Wingstop and their interest in trying to give people kind of a qualitative way to assess their interest in food. Someone else mentioned, Anna mentioned about Brazil commonly selling food by weight. Are there different techniques that you found are more successful, or one more successful than the other, when it comes to trying to help people assess or really categorize, this is the price you're paying for units of food and this is why, given the extreme economies of scale to food prep? You know, Wingstop preparing 20 wings is not much more costly to them than 10 wings for in terms of labor time. So Anna was really interested in talking about the trade-offs between the Brazil system versus what you mentioned.
And sorry, catch me up to speed again. I'm not familiar with the Brazil system. Sorry, could you say that one more time?
Selling a lot of food by weight primarily, as opposed to, you know, categorically. So buying by ounce or I would assume it would be gram there.
I see. I admittedly, I could see a lot of value in that, honestly. I don't know enough or have seen any case studies on the long-term impacts in terms of food waste reduction and behavior. I think the challenges that we have seen here, though, is related very much to the fact that many of the way our businesses are operated are really tight margins. Things have been challenging with inflation, and that has resulted in a lot of pricing going up. I think there's a lot of actual labor costs, overhead costs that goes behind all of it, not just the actual cost of the food itself. So you're paying also for the whole experience when you go into a lot of these places. So I would be interested, though, to look into that and appreciate the call out to what's being done in Brazil.
Oh, great. Thank you. I know this is something that you talked a lot about, innovations and leading companies. You know, not saying you're giving stock advice or anything, but if there was one company that you really want to invest your resources into, and that they're really doing something that's not only high impact, but really feasible, maybe even a shorter time span, which one of these companies, or one you didn't mention, would you really you know, want to tout as saying, people keep your eye out for this company?
I appreciate the question. I really try to stay away from picking winners and losers, honestly. But I will say, I think it just depends on your own personal objective metric. If you're trying to make money, some of these might not be the right fit for you because they're so early stage. If you're trying to create a really big impact in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions, I'd look at the ones that can really change consumer behavior, because we are the biggest generators of food waste. So that might be the smart storage containers. But I would say I wouldn't go and pick one though.
Okay. David, do you have a question in the room you'd like to throw out?
Yeah, Austin.
What companies does Refed work with primarily?
So, Angel, could you hear that question? What companies does Refed work with primarily? I've seen some of the logos in your partnerships, but I wonder what you have to say there.
Yeah, sure. So I would say Refed doesn't work directly with a certain set of companies. I would say that actually we have a solution provider directory of over 1,000 different organizations at this point. And what we do though is we try our best to provide services that can help them and meet their needs. But we don't work with certain ones over others necessarily. I think we also, what we do though is try to provide connections where possible because we have such a wide network. And so we do that upon request from a solution provider. Maybe the only other last thing I'll call out is that over the years, ReFed has had their own grant funds. So we do have portfolios of grantees that we have provided funding to and support, but that was very much based on what we saw as needing funding in this space.
So Travis, can I do a second question here?
Have at it, David.
Yeah, so Sarah.
Yeah, I'm wondering, Angel, how much you guys think we know about consumer mindset, including at restaurants and I guess also at home? Like I thought your point about consumers don't often or ever say they got too much food was interesting because like I've personally thought that many times, but I haven't ever gone up to I haven't ever told a waiter or a restaurant owner that was too much food. I just think it. And so I'm wondering like how much research or surveys been done about like customer satisfaction with the portions they're actually getting or having extra food on their plate, having to bring home takeout. Like it's a whole thing that I don't know how well we understand it or not.
Could you hear that, Angel?
I did hear that, yeah. And I appreciate you saying that because I do think if people were a bit more vocal, if they really thought that, maybe the industry would change their habits a bit. But I don't know. So the only organization I know that might have robust survey data on the things that you're talking about is an organization called Portion Balance Coalition. I would definitely look them up. They're a group of a lot of different organizations and academics. And I believe it started out of George Washington University. I would have to triple check that, but it's called Portion Balance Coalition, and they should have some interesting insights there.
Great.
Great questions. I've got a few more from the chat, and one of these dovetailed in with my pre-prepared question. So Vanessa sent some links in about upcoming waste bills and conferences from the Environmental Natural Resources Committee. If you'll give me just about 30 seconds, there were 19 food waste bills in the last legislature cycle, or word that had food in it. And already in the first 3 months of 2023, I guess less than 3 months, we have 6. They range from graduated organics bans to banning it just in grocery stores to items like making lunches longer and make sure that recess is before instead of after lunch. And you talked at the end a little bit about the connection of innovation through all different phases, but you mentioned policy. Can you talk a little bit about your personal and ReFed's views on the policy connection to innovation, collective action, and better information?
Yeah, absolutely. So at a high level, I would say ReFed really views policy as a key lever to helping us reduce food waste in the US. So legislative and regulatory actions can ease or even enable the implementation of food waste reduction solutions. And they're especially effective in overcoming some of the challenges where there are misaligned incentives between who's funding a solution and who's receiving the benefit. And maybe sometimes even the necessity for pre-competitive business standards, like when it comes to food safety regulations. So when implementing policy, though, we do always want to be careful of any unintended consequences, right? We want to make sure that there's infrastructure in place, that there's support, especially if it requires educating consumers. So to give you an example, there has been a lot of energy around standardizing date label language, the use by or best of use by language. But if there will require so much work to educate consumers on what exactly that means in order for it to be effective. So in terms of that connection, though, between policy and innovation, from what we see, policies can actually incentivize innovations that reduce food waste. So consider rebates, tax deductions, or other incentives that could spur the adoption of existing technologies and even encourage innovation of new ones. And that could be granted to businesses that employ the technologies. And then it can actually, based on our numbers, demonstrate an ability to reduce food waste by at least 10%.
Great, thank you. There was a lengthy thread chat while you were talking about school food waste. Lucy mentioned some personal experiences with share tables, and I think the chat, team chat, did a great job of helping provide resources. But that idea of when there are barriers that stop something that maybe was a good for reducing food waste, and how to cycle back that through to that type of mindset. Do you have experiences working with companies that hit severe barriers in their innovation activities and maybe had to change their mindset or pivot towards a different area that could maybe be a parallel encouraging story for when food waste initially failed or got delayed or stopped, and how the company institution area pivoted and came up to a new solution?
Interesting. And so, and this was, sorry, I haven't had a chance to read the chat. This is mostly in relation to in schools? Like,
Yeah, it was a share table that got shut down due to an old regulation, for policy barriers. So I was looking for a parallel because the chat did a really good job at kind of helping provide resources and background. But where there was a legal barrier that this company was doing something great, and they had to either help educate policymakers or come up with a new strategy. And this may be putting you on the spot a little bit too much, but it was a really insightful chat. Just tried to happen. So I wanted to throw that out there in case you had, and we can come back to that and let you think on it for a little bit if you like.
Yeah, I'm trying to think if I can recall a business pivot off the top of my head. Could we come back to it if that's okay?
We sure can. David, I have more questions, but if you have one in the room, I'd love to throw it back to you.
Well, I have one in the room, which is mine, Travis, but it builds off something you were just saying and goes back, Angel, to you talking just in general about educating consumers. And so I'm wondering, in a classroom setting with kids in elementary school, for example, what, people talk about times when it's kids that become aware of these kinds of issues that then start to influence parents and families and communities. What do you either know about that already, or where do you think more work needs to be done?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I can give you an interesting case study that I recently heard about. Out in Connecticut, I believe, there is a compost hauler that has built some great relationships with some of the traditional public schools in the area. And what they have found when they started working with those schools to implement composting initiatives is that they would actually involve the students in helping source separation. And at the same time that those composting programs were happening in schools, there was an increase in requested composting pickup services by households. So the idea there, yes, is that the influence that experience was having on the students was brought home, and that's why there was this increase. So what they're doing now, though, is building off of that and trying to move up the hierarchy by actually starting share tables. And so they're trying to partner with 25 schools. I would say they're actually targeting more under-resourced communities, because that's actually where a lot of the barriers end up happening, because they might not have the manpower or the resources to get that there. So they're going to try to work with under-resourced schools to start with share tables and build an educational curriculum that's then also going to be brought into the classrooms. So now you're hitting the students at multiple points, and we really believe that could actually change, their household behavior. So that's one case study where we saw it be really effective.
That's great. Thank you. Go ahead, Travis, your turn.
Hi, yes. We had a question about barriers towards integrating food waste reduction in agricultural practices. I know you mentioned that residents are the biggest collective group for food waste, but obviously businesses, processors, transporters, retailers do on a more like, for instance, per entity basis. So there's that trade-off of attacking the collective mass of food waste in a lot of individual households, or attacking businesses and generators. So this was really talking about food waste reduction, agricultural practices that ReFed might have interest in working with, or has had some actionable solutions come out of.
Yeah, well, I guess a few things though, just, after hearing that question, I think one thing I would call out though is that there is a really unique opportunity for some of those consumer facing businesses, particularly at that grocery, retail, food service stage, because they sit right in the middle of the supply chain and they have an opportunity to impact both up and down the supply chain in terms of really reducing food waste across the entire system. So we do think it's incredibly important to really focus a lot of energy there. But again, just as equally important as we were kind of discussed earlier, demand does impact supply. So there still needs to be a lot of work at the consumer level. But to get back all the way to the producer level, there's a lot of different challenges that we're seeing. The reality is that, right, there's limited labor and resourcing. Things are still pretty manual at that level. There are also a lot of constraints in terms of the SKUs, in the sense of like what a grocery retailer will accept, right, in terms of the specs, right? They're looking for pretty perfect. And so that's why we've started to see more analytics that can scan and understand and monitor the health of the produce, which is helpful. We're seeing more things happen with imperfect produce channels. The reason that's been challenging in the past, though, and we're still kind of working towards, is that the economics of that solution hasn't been worked out yet, right? If you're creating more demand of imperfects, how does it affect your like grade A produce, and how do you make all of that economics work for the producer so that they are being still efficient and really maximizing their operation? So we're looking and trying to find examples of where there were unique, interesting contracts that made the economics of imperfect surplus produce channels work. So yeah, I would say that's kind of the big thing there.
Wow, that's a really insightful example, and definitely something to consider for those areas, because we've all seen the uglies bins at different places.
Yeah.
I was just checking my phone app for the Too Good to Throw app and seeing if anything's ever come up this way, and we're still Portland South on that one. And I'll be hoping for that. David, I have another question or two I could ask, but do you have any more in the room?
Sorry, Travis, could I actually just build? Sorry, may I build on that actually real quick? That just popped in my brain. The other kind of thing too, though, as you were talking, that it reminded me is as I had mentioned before, there's a unique spot, right, that the consumer-facing businesses play on that supply chain. We do think there could be an opportunity where, let's say you have all these like imperfects that we want to move off the field and make sure it gets consumed. Oftentimes, grocery retailers actually serve prepped produce already. So there's a big opportunity there to actually use that instead, those imperfects that are still edible, for their prepped products that they offer their customers. And then they can centralize the trim. So, even though consumers might prep at home, which is great, all that trim is decentralized, right? Which is why we need all that composting infrastructure. But if you can centralize it in a like a central facility, and that maybe has its own AD or composting, that can really solve a lot of the problems along the supply chain also.
Great follow-up. Yeah, thank you. You interrupt David and me all
Sorry.
you want. Please.
Yeah,
please.
for sure. But Travis, why don't you take us out with a couple more questions?
Sure. We did have someone in the chat mention how much they love their kitchen top composter. And I myself haven't dabbled there, but I do see some push and pull with the trade-offs of more kitchen countertop activity for areas that are just barely able to have the route density for composting collections. Can you talk a little bit more about the trade-offs of areas where there's collective action, such as your community drop-off or composting routes, versus individualizing this and maybe siloing behind, and both of those have different types of price barriers. One's the price for a unit and one's a consistent payment or the time to travel to your drop-off site, and how Refed and you might be thinking about those different types of trade-offs.
Yeah, honestly, it's one of those things where, of course, there's trade-offs with everything, but there is, I think, certain solutions that are just better suited for different regions and different people. And I think that in urban areas like New York City, where I live, having these options for compost drop-off sites and also pickups actually probably might be a better fit, because the reality is, in this urban environment, when you have a composted soil amendment, what are you going to do with it? Otherwise, it's going to get wasted, right? That's not maybe the best fit for that type of solution. Now, some companies are trying to work around that by actually, I'm forgetting which company does this, but I think they actually have this set up where they provide you with a container. So all of that like odorless, generated product you put in it, and then it comes with a shipping label and everything, and it gets shipped to where it can be properly managed. So there are some unique ideas to try and manage it if, you know, in an urban environment, that's what might be the right fit. But as we saw with that food cycle case study, that's a great option, honestly, for more rural environments where they might have their own gardens or other, you know, areas where that soil amendment can be used. And that way we're making sure it's being managed properly. And I think that's kind of how we see these different solutions working together. Because again, it's an and situation, not one over the other.
Oh, great. Well, thank you so much for that. And as the chat monitor and facilitator, thank you so much. It was really a pleasure for me to listen. I guess I'll send it back to David to say us on our goodbyes.
Yeah, Angel, it's so exciting to hear how you and your colleagues at Refed are continuing to kind of work at the very front lines of all this important work. I've been following your work for a while, and even following some of the new innovations of some of the products that are out there for people. And but you do such a good job of helping us see all of the picture as opposed to just one piece, because it's obviously systems thinking is really critical to this work. It also is a source of inspiration for us that 3 weeks from Friday, on the 14th of February, I guess, I'm sorry, of April, who knows what month it is. Next 3 weeks from this Friday, we will have our third Maine Food Waste Solutions Summit that, again, Refed for us has really helped us think about how to do this work and tailor it to the needs of Maine communities and Maine businesses. So you're a great source of inspiration across the board, especially grateful that you could talk to us today. For those who are here in the room and via the chat, let's let Angel know how much we appreciate her time.
Thank you so much for having me. This was quite a pleasure, and I appreciate and really look forward to continue working with the Mitchell Center. You all do really terrific work, and it's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Angel. Take care. Thanks,
Thank you.
Travis. Great job. And thanks, Zoom audience. And thanks, folks in the room.